Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's SmartCap webinar, Fatigue by the Numbers, where we're going to share a bunch of actionable insights that our customers have found from their billions of miles experience with our real-time fatigue monitoring solution. To set the scene, I want to begin with where these numbers are coming from, the basis for these insights that we're going to show. And so what we're looking at here is a zoom in single fatigue trace or alertness score trace for an individual, where this green trace bouncing up and down is their individual fatigue scores taken roughly every 2 minutes. And the blue trace is the moving average of that. This particular example was chosen because it highlights some instances of some early warning alerts where the individual might have the opportunity to self-manage. In this particular specifically chosen example, they were unsuccessful and they progressed to an operator or a driver alarm in cab, which persisted for a period of time and led to an intervention alarm. Now at this particular site, the action to be taken was then to pull over and stop, stretch your legs, and don't turn the key and resume operations until you're back into that green zone or the more alert zone. In this particular example, the individual's alertness was still fluctuating in the alert and alert but not quite your freshest zone for several hours beyond that instance of a fatigue alarm. So this is sort of the raw snapshot of what an individual might experience in cab. But if you take all of these numbers, the alertness scores, the early warning alerts, and the fatigue alarms, and you take them for an entire workforce over weeks, months, and years, a bunch of insights become true for each individual business, and that's what we're focused on today. But the number one question we get is, how often are we at risk? How many times are we going to have to ask an individual to park up, stretch their legs, and better manage fatigue? And the answer to that depends on the business, but generally speaking, somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5% of the time, an individual will find themselves at risk where some sort of intervention is required. And that intervention might be something that they can handle by themselves, or it might be something where the business needs some external intervention, like interaction with a supervisor. This, though, is talking about just the times when we're at risk, but not particularly severe risk. The number changes and it goes down to when we're talking about imminent risk, where really good science says there's no choice now but to have significant intervention. And that represents 0.1% of the time. But both these numbers, 0.5%, 0.1%, seem like very small numbers. But how that translates to the impact on a business is that in a fleet of, say, 100 trucks, there are 20 instances per 12-hour shift where an individual finds themselves at imminent risk. That's how often we're at risk. If we ask the counter question, how often are we alert? The answer is much more pleasant. It turns out, all things considered, we're about 94.5% of the time in the alert zone. And this is a mix of the very alert state as well as the alert but not quite your freshest state. So the gap between this 94.5% and the 0.5% representing the times when intervention is really required is this 5.1% wedge we see. And this is the opportunity where the person's showing symptoms of early impairment, but where they're still safe to operate equipment, where self-management is important. And so we're going to touch back on this later in the presentation. This 5.1% of the time is the true opportunity for individuals to take control of their fatigue risk and self-manage without the business needing to intervene when we get to that much thinner part of the wedge. This is more a snapshot of looking at all time and where we find ourselves on the alertness and fatigue spectrum. But it turns out not all times of the day and night are the same. When we map the average fatigue or alertness scores over the 24 hours of the day, what typically reveals itself is this classic bathtub shape, where we have higher fatigue scores and lower alertness scores in the nighttime hours, and higher alertness scores or lower fatigue scores during daytime hours. This is typical of most individuals, but every individual has a unique alertness profile, and so how they manage their fatigue, how they prepare for work, may be different based on their alertness profile. What we see though is that if we simply isolate when those points of business intervention kick in, we see a similar trend. So what we're looking at here is a map purely looking at when the fatigue alarms occur. And again, we see many more fatigue alarms occurring during nighttime hours, with the highest risk time typically being between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. A different way to look at these sorts of insights or patterns with respect to time is to step away from the single day or the 24 hours and start looking at shift rosters. And what we're looking at today is a 4-4 roster pattern, just to keep things simple. When we look at the 4 day shifts of a 4-4 roster pattern, what we see is pretty similar fatigue scores throughout the 4 days, with slightly higher fatigue scores or lower alertness on the 4th day shift. This pattern is significantly different on night shift, with this pattern showing substantially higher fatigue scores during the first night shift. And the other key insight here is that all night shifts within the roster panel have higher fatigue scores than all of the other daytime shifts. This particular example is for a 4-4 roster where individuals worked for 4 day shifts. They had their 24-hour break, or what we sometimes call a pajama day, and then immediately started their 4 night shifts, after which they had some time off work. This pattern looks a little bit different, this pattern being the first night shift being the worst, when we have a break of days between our day roster and our night roster. So an example might be 4 day shifts, then having 4 days off, then doing your 4 night shifts and having another 4 days off. And in that particular roster, what we typically see is the second night shift is the highest risk shift. The explanation for this, looking back when we have a pajama day, is that within that 24-hour break, switching from day shift to night shift, most people struggle to know when the best time to sleep is. And so what they typically find is that they don't get enough sleep prior and they really, really struggle on that first night shift. Whereas in this other roster pattern, there's ample time during those 4 days off to prepare appropriately for that first night shift, but it's still an adjustment, and it's that second night shift where it's the first time we've had to go to sleep in the morning after work, go to bed in the morning after work, wake up in the afternoon before work and go to bed in the morning after work, where that second night shift is the most dominant in terms of fatigue risk. Not all individuals express this same pattern of higher fatigue risk at the shift change that they struggle with. In fact, it turns out that 21.1% of all users in our database handle the shift rotation extremely well. So these individuals, these are your superstars. These are the ones where you can talk to them and learn what is it that they're doing to prepare for shift. When are they choosing to go to sleep? How are they coping with the transition from day to night or night to day? What you can learn from them can help your other workforce reduce their risk during that transition. This is a great example that not all individuals are the same, and it turns out that it doesn't just apply to transition between shifts, it applies to how often fatigue alarms occur. And so in the case of SmartCap, we would often refer to these as high alarm rate individuals. And this is a snapshot example, just looking at the top 10 alarm rate individuals within a particular workforce. The first thing you'd notice is that the alarm rate in the far right column is quite different between number 1 and number 10. What's not shown here is that another 40 or more operators from this workforce had no alarms at all. So the overwhelming majority of most workforces in any given period of time, say 2 months or 3 months, will not have received a fatigue alarm. And it's just a very small number of individuals that represent the overwhelming majority of risk. These are the individuals that need the most help most urgently, and the remaining individuals or operators represent the remainder of that risk. So in this case, 7 operators represented the outstanding 12%. To boil this down on a larger scale, what we generally find is 4 to 7% of individuals account for greater than 70% of all risk events within a business. And this is a scary figure, but the great news is this is actually an opportunity for targeted assistance. By focusing your efforts on those individuals, not only can you very rapidly de-risk your business, but you can identify the underlying cause of the fatigue and help these individuals improve their quality of life. One thing we do know is when it comes to risk and the reductions in risk over time, culture plays a significant role. And so when considering these individuals, the high alarm rate individuals, one thing we like to look at is the average residency time. And basically that's saying, how long do those individuals stay at the top of the list? How often do they represent most of the risk within a business? Within businesses where we would subjectively assess them as having a positive culture, being highly engaged, the average residency time is a little over 7 weeks. And what that means is within 7 weeks, the business is able to identify these individuals, work through a formal business process to help these individuals identify the root cause and remedy it. And then we start to see the effects. For businesses that are less engaged or have a poorer safety culture, there's an enormous difference. And these individuals can stay near the top of the list or be subject to significant fatigue on a regular basis for nearly a year. When we dive deeper, regardless of how long individuals stay at the top of the list, when we dig deeper into the why, what's the underlying or driver behind the high alarm rate that this individual is experiencing, what we find is higher average fatigue scores all day and all night, or what we call chronic fatigue, accounts for 3/4 of the individuals that have higher alarm rates. The remaining, however, relates to the limited ability or limited intent to self-manage at that thinner 5% wedge we touched on earlier. When it's the opportunity to self-manage your fatigue risk, what we find is around 1/4 of the workforce simply do not or do not know how to. And so what this shows is chronic fatigue represents most of or 3/4 of the individuals with the higher alarm rate. And that then is the beginning of solving a riddle, finding out how we can help these individuals by first finding out the underlying cause of fatigue. For 1/4, however, this is simply about providing tips on how to self-manage or reminding them how important that it is. And 2 of our prior webinars touched on each of these 2 topics. One of them touched on how to develop a formal business process to identify the underlying root cause and help individuals with chronic fatigue. And another webinar talked about how to focus on self-management, the tips that work and the tips that don't work. What we do know about self-management is that, much like the brochure says, people do learn what works best for them when they receive real-time feedback. And so routinely, we see business after business that month on month, people's ability to self-manage, that's the percentage of time when receiving an early warning alert, they're able to bring themselves back into the green zone, improves over time. This trend tends to continue to what we have today of around a 97% global average in the ability of individuals to self-manage without anyone else in the business needing to intervene. There's a lot of factors that go into how well we self-manage our fatigue risk. And it turns out one of those factors is how far we are into the shift or how far we are into the journey. And so when we break up either journeys or shifts into 10% segments, what we find is that at the beginning of a shift or the beginning of a journey, individuals are highly effective at self-managing. And the further we get into our shift or the further we get into our journey, our ability to self-manage significantly reduces. Now, I've used the term ability, but what's hard because we can't read minds, we don't know if this is really a reduction in their ability because of the onset of fatigue, or is this a reluctance to self-manage because people stop caring quite so much about their fatigue risk as the long days or the long nights go forward. We don't know, but this is a valuable insight to start talking to individuals, to start saying, this is really critical. And so some businesses, by seeing an insight like this, take the action that in the second half of shifts, when individuals receive an early warning alert, so does somebody else, so that they can get on the radio or get on the phone to that individual and say, hey, could you do this for me? Could you self-manage right now so we can get you through to the end of the shift safely? What we've looked at so far is really how people's fatigue risk or ability to self-manage changes with time. We've looked at the 24 hours of the day, we've looked at different shift patterns, and even here, looking at across a journey or a shift. Another way to look at this data is based on location. And so sometimes businesses will look at their fatigue risk on a national or a state level, where we're able to zoom in and identify particular routes, particular sections of road that are higher risk than others. And when we're looking at this fairly high level, what we notice is that fatigue risk is generally higher on straight, boring stretches of road, and worse still, boring stretches of road that run east to west, particularly around the times of sunrise and sunset. And this fairly obviously is due to eye strain, and where we know eye strain brings the onset of fatigue much more quickly than non-eye strain. When we dive a little bit deeper, say in a mining application, we tend to zoom in not at the highway or state level, but at the particular intersectional roadway level. When we do that in a mining setting, for example, what we typically find is that fatigue alarms are triggered more so at dump sites and loading sites. And though that might be annoying because those are the times where you need to be doing more things, it turns out that it's the handful of minutes prior to that, which are generally slow ramps that we have to go down or up quite slowly. Those long ramps are what's causing the fatigue that's becoming evident at the dump site or the load site. And so more than 3/4 of individuals report a self-identified pattern that most of their fatigue alarms are happening when they're being loaded. And this is the cause. It's the slow ramp decline or incline prior to the load or dump site. Since we're recording GPS, one of the things we can do is look at how that GPS position changes with time and see the impact of speed of the vehicle. And so what we do see is that the differing travel speeds have a significant impact on fatigue alarm rate. And so what this shows here is a greater than 500% increased alarm rate when a vehicle is stuck in traffic or waiting in queue. And again, it's impossible to know exactly why this is true, but the most important factors that go into this equation would be the fact that when we're stopped moving, the part of our brain that tells us, the non-conscious part of our mind that tells us falling asleep will hurt me, slows down or switches off because we're safe and comfortable. And in particularly cold climates or particularly warm climates, where we've adjusted the air conditioner to what is now a comfortable temperature in a gently vibrating or rocking cab of a truck, when we're parked in queue or stuck in traffic, it's almost as if it's rocking us to sleep. And this becomes evident in the data. From an action point of view, some of our transport or port customers have used this information to share with their logistics partners to identify the impact that queuing or poor scheduling is having on their fatigue risk as a motivator to improve truck queuing or reduce truck queuing by improving load scheduling. The final insight I wanted to share today was what we start to see when we look at the seasonal impacts. And so this particular shot here is looking at the fatigue alarm rate or the alarms per hour of use that occurred on a monthly basis, going back from January 2018 through to last month. The first thing we notice is this sort of cyclical trend of winter versus summer, with higher fatigue alarm rates during winter and lower fatigue alarm rates during summer. And this particular graph is from a location that has extremely cold winters and fairly warm summers. So this exaggerates the difference between winter and summer somewhat. The most extreme we've seen is winter options, or winter sites with very cold winters such as snow, have a 3 times greater alarm rate than they do when it's summertime. The other thing we see from this is a general trend downwards, and that this site in the space of 2.5 years or so has reduced their average fatigue alarm rate by 71%. This is a fantastic result, but the greater news is that in this entire 2.5 year period, this business has had a sum total of 0 fatigue incidents. So the fact that they're getting real-time alarms is helping them better manage their fatigue. It's helping them eliminate fatigue incidents, but by learning what people learn with real-time feedback, by learning to better self-manage, by making lifestyle changes, in addition to that, they've reduced their risk profile by 71%, which is a fantastic result. So with all of these insights that I've provided, the motivation or your path to an insight starts with the adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. Without knowing these factoids about our particular business, and they're different for every business, without knowing these, we don't know where to focus our efforts. But despite the 20 or so different insights I've shared with you today, what might surprise you is that we didn't have to measure very much at all. In fact, all we really measured was people's shift roster patterns and when they fall. We measured the time and date of whatever we were recording, and we measured the GPS location. And all 3 of these, most businesses, if not all businesses, have access to today. Some businesses have access to the very last piece of this puzzle, which is real-time measurements of alertness or fatigue. Now, if your business has alertness and fatigue scores going back in time, and you'd like some advice on how to draw some greater insights from that, or alternatively, if you don't, and you'd like to start getting access to these sorts of insights, reach out to us. The SmartCap team is here to help. This is what we do for a living, and this is what we love doing, is helping businesses get people home safe every day. So if you'd like these sorts of insights, please reach out to us. So thanks very much for joining us for today's webinar. Please keep an eye on our LinkedIn feed for the next topic. Goodbye.